Please be advised, Once Upon a Crime is a series depicting true crime incidents in South Africa. The content may not be suitable for sensitive listeners. Listener discretion is advised. The views and opinions expressed during Once Upon a Crime is not that of the SABC and Lotus FM. Hello and welcome to Season 2, Episode 4 of Once Upon a Crime. My name is Keshav Dass. I am your presenter on the Night Cafe, only on Lotus FM. And today's episode focuses on one of South Africa's most infamous serial murderers. He's been called South Africa's Jeffrey Dahmer, and he's been called the ABC Killer. His real name, though, is Moses Sithole, and this is the story of his crimes.
Moses Sithole was born on the 17th of November 1964. He was one of 6 children, and he unfortunately did not have a very happy childhood. His father passed away when he was very young, and his mother was completely overwhelmed trying to raise 6 children on her own, and she eventually gave the children up for adoption. Moses was placed into a care facility where he says he was sexually assaulted by some of the older boys. He ran away from the facility, and he says that he tracked his mother down and went to her, hoping that she would take him in, but she rejected him and told him to leave. Moses ended up living with an older brother for a while, and then he started moving around the country working on farms before he returned to live on the East Rand of Gauteng when he was 23 years old.
Research shows that serial killers usually start committing their crimes in their late 20s and early 30s on average. But we also know that those killers whose crimes have a sexual element to them often start far younger, committing sexual assaults and rapes without killing their victims, and then they tend to progress onto killing their victims later on. And that's exactly the pattern that we saw with Moses, right?
That's right. Although his first 3 known rape victims would only actually come forward much later, by 1989, Sithole had raped 4 women in total, and the 4th woman would become instrumental in getting him behind bars for the first time. At this time, Moses was handed down a 10-year sentence for this rape victim. He continued to claim his innocence, though, and he would actually use this incarceration as an excuse for why he decided to start killing women when he was paroled.
This type of behavior is also a known pattern with these kinds of offenders, though. We've seen other sexually motivated serial killers commit rapes, go to prison for them, and then when they get out, they start killing their victims. And although they will often blame the victims for this, claiming that they were just getting revenge for being wrongfully accused, it is actually more strategic than that.
It absolutely is. So really, what this pattern is the offender deciding, once they've been in prison for rape, that they are not going back to prison. And that doesn't mean they stop offending. It means that they decide that their victims will not be able to report them because they will permanently silence them. And that is exactly what Moses started doing almost immediately after he was released from prison in 1993. Now, it's really difficult for us to be sure what order Moses's victims were killed in, because their bodies would often be found in severely decomposed states, which makes determining the date of death very difficult. Police would work with the days that the victims were last seen alive to try and figure out some sort of order, and later the profiler working on the case, Mickey Pistorius, would look at how the women were killed to sort of map out a form of progression in modus operandi. And that would also help to determine when the victims were likely killed.
An interesting thing about this case is that although Moses claimed that he was being wrongfully accused of rape, his earlier rape victims, who didn't come forward until he was caught for the murders, actually mentioned that he used a similar modus operandi on them that he ended up using on the murder victims. So what was it that Moses was doing to lure these victims, Nicole?
There were 2 parts of his ruse, really. One was that he assumed a fake identity, and he often introduced himself as Martin. And that on its own became valuable evidence because the earlier rape victims had also known him as Martin and not Moses. Then he essentially used these women's vulnerability by virtue of them being unemployed against them and claimed that he had jobs for them, either at various companies or at this fake charity organization he'd invented, which he claimed helped to rescue abused children. Now, if you've never been unemployed and really desperate for a job, you might find it difficult to understand why these women would just go with a complete stranger. But really, that desperation to just get money to eat is what was driving their thoughts at the time. And Moses was also incredibly charming, well-dressed, and he spoke really well as well. So these women really would have let their guards down.
So, Nicole, once Moses had lured these women to an isolated spot, was he then behaving the same way at each and every crime scene?
For the most part, yes. Once he had a victim alone, he would attack her, rape her, and strangle her. The method of strangulation advanced and changed throughout the series, though. He started with manual strangulation, so with his hands. Then he moved to using ligatures, which was usually an item of the victim's clothing. And then he started using what's called a garrote, which is essentially a piece of stick or another sort of solid item tied to a piece of material and then twisted. By using the garrote, he figured out that he could actually extend how long it took for him to kill the victims, which is obviously incredibly sadistic, but this clearly gave him a greater degree of satisfaction in his crimes. His first known murder occurred on the 14th of July 1994 when he killed 19-year-old Maria Monama, and his last known murder victim was discovered on the 14th of October 1995. Unfortunately, that victim was unidentified. During that period, Moses Sithole was believed to have killed at least 36 women.
So, how did they eventually end up catching him?
Honestly, there are so many ups and downs in this case that there isn't a simple answer to that question, but really it would be Moses's own ego and his desire to sort of get acknowledgement that would get him caught. He did all sorts of strange things like getting in contact with journalists, and eventually it would be that arrogance that saw him being arrested, and he was actually shot in the process of the arrest, but he did make a recovery. His trial started in 1996, and it was one of the biggest the country had ever seen, with over 350 witnesses appearing for the state alone. Moses's defense was essentially that he didn't do any of it, and he was very arrogant and taunted the surviving victims and the families throughout the trial. He was, however, found guilty, and when the judge sentenced him, he said that he wished he still had the death sentence available to him, as he would have preferred to have sent Moses to the gallows. Moses was sentenced before we had our current sentencing setup of life sentences. So his sentence is quite strange. It's essentially 2,410 years in jail with a mandatory period of 800 years. Now, to be fair, today he could probably challenge the way that sentence was set up, but it would likely just result in his sentence being commuted or translated to 36 life sentences. And in my opinion, there really is very little chance that he would ever realistically be considered for parole.
How much do we think Moses's difficult childhood and the abuse that he claimed to suffer influence his crimes?
So I think it's important to say that, it is possible for us to have empathy for the child that Moses Sithole was, who has certainly, suffered some very difficult and challenging times and abuse and neglect, while simultaneously not excusing the acts that he committed as an adult. I often hear when I chat to people, through my podcast, people are sort of wary to acknowledge any trauma that an offender may have suffered in their life because they feel like they're excusing their acts. But those can be two totally different things. Also, it's important for us to say that there are millions of survivors of exactly this type of trauma who never commit these types of crimes, or any crimes for that matter. So really it's not a direct result, absolutely not. However, the other interesting side of it is that almost all serial killers can show some form of abuse that they experienced in their childhood. So there is some small correlation, but it is not necessarily a matter of, because I was abused as a child, I am therefore going to commit horrendous crimes as I grow up. It's completely the opposite.
How did Moses get away with so many murders in a relatively short space of time?
I think we need to sort of firstly acknowledge the period during which this was happening. So Moses was part of a sort of surge in serial killings that happened in South Africa almost as apartheid was falling, when everyone in South Africa had the freedom to move around freely. No one was sort of forced to stay in certain areas. Everyone could start moving around. And what that time in South Africa did was it did two things. Firstly, the very, rightfully gave everyone the freedom to move. But when that happened, those who, like Moses, had these sort of nefarious intentions, suddenly saw that they had this huge group of vulnerable people who were moving away from their families, moving into different provinces to find work, maybe find more resource places to stay, see what the provinces were like outside of where they'd been born. And serial killers definitely used this huge group of vulnerable victims to be able to start hunting, essentially. And these people weren't in contact with their families. So many of the women that Moses would have been killing, unfortunately, quite a few of them were never identified. They were likely not from what was still then the Transvaal province, now Gauteng. And likely their families just lost contact with them and probably never knew what happened to them. So there was no one to report them missing. And that's, these women were so vulnerable because he could just carry on going and going and going. As long as he hid the bodies well enough, no one really knew a serial killer was at play until he had, until they started putting the pictures together. And by then, he'd taken so many victims already.
So there was another serial murderer allegedly active around the same time in the same place with a strangely similar modus operandi. How did police figure out who had killed which victims, and what happened to that serial murderer?
So this case is quite interesting in that, again, we had that surge of serial killers around this time. So, through their investigations, they started to figure out that some of the victims did not seem to entirely match Moses's sort of modus operandi, but it was so similar. And they actually ended up arresting another man called David Selepe. And police alleged that he confessed to some of these crimes, to having been a serial killer at that time. Some people thought that Moses and David may have been working together, but Moses has always denied that. And David actually ended up being shot at a crime scene, and he died. He tried to escape. He was pointing out crime scenes during his confession process, and he tried to attack a police officer with a stick, and they ended up shooting him and killing him. And to this day, the answer to how do they know who killed who is they actually don't. And that is why I always, he was convicted, Moses was convicted of killing 36 women. But there is certainly, I think, evidence to say that he killed many, many more than that. and that if David Selepe really had killed anyone at all, it was actually a very few of the victims that were in this entire series.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. That's where we wrap up Season 2, Episode 4 of Once Upon a Crime. Join us next week for the final episode of this season, brought to you by the Night Cafe on Lotus FM. Once Upon a Crime, where true crime meets the night.